These are the metaphysical teachings of P. L. Swan.
Hey, it's PL, and today I'm going to be talking about consciousness, more specifically, the fact that we have a soul, that we have an essential consciousness, that is our true self, and the fact that consciousness, the experience of existing, underlies all reality. When we read certain scientific theories about consciousness, there are those on the side of materialism who would suggest that our our conscious experience is a product of brain activity or physical matter. I would like to suggest that there is no logic behind this assumption. In fact, the only logical assumption is that consciousness is intrinsic to matter and physical reality. Why? Because we, human beings, are the one aspect of physical reality that we get to experience firsthand. We are the only thing in existence that we actually experience from the inside. We can observe physical laws, we can observe the world around us, animals, atoms, cells, the growth of plants, the way that the waves move. We can look at the laws of physics and postulate why certain things move and interact and react as they do. But when it comes to actually being on the inside, it is our own experience that we get to experience firsthand. And there's no reason to think that the experience of being, the experience of self, the experience of experiencing reality is dependent upon human consciousness or human psychology. Certainly, our intellect and our human nature is specific to our brains, to our brain activity, to our development as human animals in the womb and in our life as children and adults. There are many aspects of our psychology and our ego nature which come into being in the human experience. But there's a great difference between human psychology and an innate experience of existing. Descartes, the philosopher, said that the one thing he could know was, in a sense, to paraphrase, was that he existed himself. When he said, "I think, therefore I am," he wasn't talking about thinking in terms of some intellectual thought process. He was talking about the fact that his thinking was an experience of himself observing existence. He could doubt all things, he said, but that very act of doubting could not be doubted. Doubting was occurring, doubting being a form of thought, and thought being a personal experience. The specifics of that experience would have to do with psychology and brain activity, but the experience itself, the inner experience of existing that is not dependent upon thought, is the place that we start from because it's the only thing we actually experience of this reality. And what is the more logical assumption? When we look at the way things move and the way a plant grows and the way that physical laws work, and we look at motion, we look at action and reaction, there's no reason to assume that these processes are devoid of consciousness. That doesn't mean they're thinking like human beings, that atoms are going, let's see, how are we going to react to this particular situation? But that's not the point. It isn't dependent upon human psychology, but an innate consciousness. To assume an innate consciousness within all things is far more logical than to assume that there is no consciousness within all things. Where does this assumption come from? Why is it that there is a certain um, assumption within materialistic science that we should start from the platform that there's no consciousness in matter and physics? Where does this come from? Where does this come from? It doesn't come from anything. Consciousness is within matter because otherwise we ourselves could not experience ourselves as being. You know, we don't think about it. We don't think about the vast gap between unfeeling matter, the idea of unfeeling matter, which actually there's no such thing, unfeeling matter and an experience of being. We can say, well, the brain activity is complicated in such and such a way, so an experience, an illusion of it, of self, comes into being, like a magic trick. An experience of self comes into being because of the complexity of these dead interactions between dead, unfeeling things. Imagine if there were an infinite or virtually infinite amount of teeny tiny rocks flying around everywhere, and there was some force, some, you know, you could say some God, but let's just say some unconscious force, some just random force that happened to spin and control these little rocks in a way that they formed incredibly complicated formations and patterns and interactions, and eventually different levels of organization. Incredibly complicated. But they're still just teeny tiny little rocks, infinite teeny tiny little rocks making up all these incredibly complex forms. No matter how complicated those forms got, where the hell would a conscious experience come from? It wouldn't come from anywhere unless conscious experience was intrinsic within those rocks, or at least as a potential, and the potential for consciousness is the same thing as consciousness. There has to be the potential for consciousness innate within reality. Consciousness is innate within reality because we experience ourselves, and there's no theory that can say that can show that consciousness is dependent upon human psychology and somehow springs into being out of nothing because our brains got so complex. We don't even realize how illogical this assumption is until we actually examine it. It's like it's not even addressed. It's this invisible magic trick that's assumed to occur by the magical force of complexity. There's no logic behind that. The fact is that we human beings are not so different than the rest of existence. If you looked from a vast distance at the universe and everything in it, from quantum physics to the spinning of planets to various chemical reactions on various planets and the life forms on Earth and certainly in other parts of the universe. Excuse me. If you observed this and saw all of the patterns and all of the motion, human beings are just a part of this. We are not some exceptional part. And even though human psychology is unique to ourselves, it's absolutely logical to assume, as a starting point, that consciousness, the consciousness that drives everything we do, is within all of these other patterns. If there's other life forms, animals, cells within physical constructs such as a body or a plant. Of course, there are physical laws and there are processes and patterns of nature. these things are not contradictory whatsoever. But what is deepest within all of this is a inner experience of being. There is an inner experience that propels these various patterns and laws. There is a shape to reality, there is a physics, there is a geometry in which this feeling, this consciousness works. But the consciousness is there and it's real and it's ultimately the driving force behind all of this. That's the only logical assumption. It should be the starting assumption, even in science, because even though science tries not to operate on assumptions, if there's enough evidence, if an assumption is made, it should follow the evidence. There is no evidence by which we should start from an assumption that consciousness does not underlie matter and energy, that somehow matter and energy is devoid of experience and feeling. Where does this assumption come from? Where do we have some evidence that consciousness does not lie within all things? People have said to me, when you have a belief, it's your obligation to prove that belief. But I'm not talking about a belief. I'm talking about making an assumption either way, because we don't know for sure, at least intellectually. So why would we make an assumption either way? It's just as logical to ask a materialist to prove that consciousness does not lie within all things. It's more logical because, again, we're human beings. We're part of all of this. We're not some exception. And our experience of being is not exceptional. Our human psychology is unique to human beings, just as the nature of a dog or the nature of a fly or the nature of some alien out in some other galaxy is unique. But that's different than consciousness itself. Now, of course, I cannot prove this on an intellectual basis to someone who wants to think the other way. I know this because through my meditation and through my own seeking of my most essential self, I have come to experience that I am conscious beyond my human psychology. So I do know that consciousness is not dependent upon human psychology. However, I cannot prove this, nor am I seeking to prove this. All I am seeking to do is to get you to consider that your consciousness is deeper than your mind, and that consciousness itself is what lies beneath all that we observe, all physical phenomena, and that this consciousness, that is our essential self or soul, and that is the basis for all things that can be observed, whether in this world or in the deeper levels of physics, that is real, that is life, and that this deeper consciousness is worth pursuing, first within yourself, and then within a broadening understanding of reality as something alive. This is a far greater vision, but it's more than that. It truly is the more logical assumption when we really think about it. Our feeling, our deeper feelings, not necessarily just the emotions, human emotions that we have on a daily basis, but our deeper feelings, whether you're talking about love or a deep desire for existence, for life, for discovery, for truth, these are real things. And the dry and dead little voice that says they are illusion actually makes no sense. That's a dead little voice of ego. Ego either pumps itself up, or it, in its despair at its knowledge of how small it really is, it seeks to diminish existence. And that dry little voice of ego tries to tell us that our self, our deepest self, is an illusion. But that actually doesn't make any sense. And you can also feel it. If you move past pure intellect, although I believe in intellect, and I have come to the conclusion that an intellectual understanding of reality will lead us to believe consciousness is intrinsic to all things. However, deeper than intellect, there's also just that deeper knowing, the feeling of reality. Can you prove that you truly love someone or something? Of course, you cannot prove it, but that is real. And that dead little voice that says it's just illusion, don't listen to it. You don't have to listen to that. Don't leave your mind behind. I believe our minds and our intelligence and our intellect is a great tool for understanding reality and for challenging ideas that actually don't make sense. I believe that truth makes sense. Truth does make sense, but we have to go deep. We have to go really deep into not just our own experience, but into the ideas that are out there, and we have to really examine them carefully. And I believe, I know, that when we do, the truth that will emerge is the truth that our experience of being is truly real. It is real. First of all, it's real because we know it's real because we're experiencing it. So it is real. But then there's the voice that says it could be an illusion. And that actually doesn't make sense. Where does that illusion come from? An illusion of consciousness? An illusion experiencing itself? If it's not an illusion, an unreal thing experiencing itself, being fooled by itself to think that it is real, which makes no sense whatsoever, then what's experiencing the illusion? What is being fooled by the illusion of consciousness? Doesn't make sense. We are real, deeper than our psychology, and not only us, but all things that we observe. All of the forces of nature, the growing tree, the crashing wave, the clouds fleeing across the sky in the wind. Deeper than that, the bubbling depths and mystery of quantum physics is alive. It's alive with consciousness, with inner experience of being, which is part of something even deeper, the vast mystery of what we call God. That is the truth. And you can challenge your intellect to believe this, because it does make more sense. Not only does your heart tell you this is true, but your mind can tell you this is true as well, if you really think about it.